You won't believe my neighbor tried to get my tree chopped down, and it's her own yard that collapses. I had lived in Willow Creek Estates for nearly 6 years, long enough to know the quirks of my neighborhood and the personalities of my neighbors. Most of them were quiet, polite, and kept to themselves. Everyone except Karen. Karen moved in 2 months ago, armed with a clipboard, a binder of HOA rules, and the kind of confidence only someone convinced that the world revolved around them could muster. From day one, she made her presence known. At first, it was small things, remarking on my lawn's uneven growth, questioning my choice of flowers, and hinting that my fence might not meet community standards. Then came the tree. It wasn't a particularly large tree, just a flowering dogwood that I had planted years ago. It provided shade, added beauty, and had become something of a landmark in my backyard. Karen, however, saw it differently. On a Wednesday morning, I received a sharply worded letter under my door. The HOA had received a formal complaint from a resident claiming that my tree was illegal, obstructing views, and in violation of community standards. I read the note twice, then 3 times, expecting the ink to fade or the words to change into something reasonable. They did not. The letter demanded that I either remove the tree immediately or face fines. Naturally, my first thought was, which one of our neighbors could be this insane? I didn't have to look far. A few hours later, I caught Karen peering over her fence, binoculars in hand, muttering under her breath. When she noticed me staring, she waved casually, as if the invasion of my privacy was perfectly acceptable. Over the next few days, her actions escalated. She began photographing the tree daily, sending emails to the HOA with increasingly absurd claims, leaves falling on the sidewalk, roots supposedly threatening neighboring foundations, and wild conjectures about property devaluation. Every email she copied management and the board, turning my minor backyard tree into a community scandal. I decided to respond calmly. I documented the tree's health, its distance from property lines, and included a small report from a certified arborist confirming that it posed 0 risk. I sent the report to the HOA, CCing Karen, with a polite note explaining that the tree was safe, legal, and compliant with all community guidelines. Karen didn't reply. She never did. Instead, her attacks became indirect but relentless. The following week, I came home to find a series of sticky notes lining my driveway. Unsafe tree. Violation of HOA standards. Neighbors deserve better. Each note carried the same thinly veiled threat. If you don't comply, we escalate. I wanted to ignore it, but the next day brought my first real shock. Karen had apparently filed an official request for an emergency HOA inspection. She claimed the tree posed a dangerous structural hazard and demanded immediate removal. When the HOA scheduled the inspection, I knew I had to be proactive. The morning of the inspection, I met the arborist at my property. While he assessed the tree's roots and branches, I noticed Karen lurking across the street, taking notes, occasionally talking into a phone with an urgent tone. It was clear she was already plotting her next move, expecting my tree to be condemned. The arborist finished the inspection, shaking his head. No issues. Healthy tree. No property damage. It's safe. I sighed, relieved, and called the HOA inspector, explaining that the tree was fully compliant. He agreed to report the findings to the board. Karen's response was immediate. The following morning, I discovered a small commotion in her own backyard. Part of her old wooden shed had collapsed under the weight of accumulated debris and a sudden storm the night before. One of her decorative trees had fallen, smashing a portion of the shed and scattering bricks and garden tools everywhere. Word traveled fast. Some neighbors whispered and chuckled as they passed by, remarking how the tree karma had struck. Yet Karen didn't stop. She still sent emails, now accusing me of mocking the community by ignoring the safety hazards. I realized then that logic, evidence, and consequences didn't matter. Karen was driven by obsession, not reason. Over the weekend, her campaign expanded. Flyers appeared in the community mailbox. Neighborhood safety alert. Potential hazard in 23B with a poorly drawn sketch of my tree. Anonymous emails were sent to other neighbors warning them about the dangerous, illegal tree threatening our properties. Karen's obsession had become a neighborhood spectacle. It was during this period that I decided to take preemptive action. I installed discreet cameras around my yard, not to invade her privacy, but to document harassment. Every approach, every photo, every intrusive action would now be on record. Karen did not disappoint. Within 48 hours, she returned, binoculars in hand, clearly aware of the new surveillance. She paced across the street, talking loudly on the phone. Unaware the camera is capturing her, she gestured dramatically, cataloging my yard like an inspector on a mission. The tipping point arrived midweek. As I reviewed the footage, I noticed something extraordinary. Karen had tripped over her own garden hose while attempting to measure my tree from a curb. She fell hard, knocking over a planter, breaking her garden statue, and spraining her ankle. I couldn't help but smake, noting the poetic justice of the moment. Neighbors who witnessed the incident whispered about instant karma, but Karen, ever defiant, refused to acknowledge her misfortune as anything other than a minor setback. She hobbled inside her house, swearing under her breath, no doubt plotting her next escalation. By the end of Chapter 2, the tension had shifted slightly. While Karen remained aggressive, her own property misfortunes had begun to reveal cracks in her control. Meanwhile, my documentation and legal preparation ensured that the HOA, neighbors, and authorities were aware of the full story, setting the stage for the second hook that would keep viewers glued to the narrative. She tried to destroy my tree, but you won't believe what finally destroyed her own yard. Storm damage and a partial collapse were reported. Dozen that suggest that focusing on others' trees while neglecting your own property is inconsistent. Her defense faltered. She muttered something about unforeseen circumstances, but the board was not swayed. Her credibility was crumbling in real time. Finally, the president addressed the meeting formally. Based on the evidence, it is clear that the complaints regarding the dogwood tree at 23B are unfounded. The tree is compliant with HOA regulations, poses no safety threat, and the property owner has taken appropriate measures to document and maintain it. Any future complaints by the same resident will be reviewed under our harassment policy. Karen's shoulders slumped, and the tension in the room shifted. Where she had entered with an air of control and authority, she now seemed small, exposed, and defeated. After the meeting, I walked outside to catch my breath. I glanced across the street at Karen's yard. One of her own decorative trees had fallen further, the remaining branches swaying precariously. It was as if nature itself had joined the narrative. Word spread quickly. Neighbors whispered as they passed my house, "Did you see the board meeting?" Karen tried to manipulate everyone, and it blew up in her face. The atmosphere in the community had changed. She was no longer the intimidating figure she had been. Her influence waned, replaced by a cautious, almost pitiful presence. By evening, I received a note slipped under my door from one of the HOA members. "Thank you for your patience and for handling this professionally. Your approach was exemplary." Karen, meanwhile, retreated into her home. She avoided the street, avoided eye contact, and even refused to attend community events for several weeks. The obsession that had driven her daily life had met with undeniable consequence. The next few days brought subtle but telling signs. Notices were posted reminding residents that harassment would not be tolerated, and the HOA clarified that complaints should be evidence-based and reasonable. My tree remained untouched, thriving as it always had, a quiet symbol of balance restored. Yet, I knew better than to assume the story had ended. Karen's obsession had always been about control. While she had lost this battle publicly, I anticipated her next move. That's why the surveillance remained active, and why I continued documenting her behaviors. She lost in front of the HOA, but wait until she tries one last desperate move. You won't believe what happens next. She thought she could win by escalating, but karma had other plans waiting for her. After the HOA meeting, I thought things might settle. My tree was safe, the board had ruled in my favor, and neighbors were beginning to breathe easier. But Karen had never been one to accept defeat quietly. She retreated into her home for a few days, only to return with a plan that would escalate her obsession beyond anything I had seen before. It began subtly. At first, she tried to quietly manipulate the neighbors, whispering about hidden dangers and how the HOA ignored the rules. But soon, her actions became audacious. One morning, I noticed her attempting to erect a makeshift barrier across my driveway, claiming it was for tree safety inspections. She didn't expect me to confront her immediately, but I caught her in the act and calmly documented the incident. The next escalation came when she decided to attempt a legal maneuver. She had contacted a private attorney, claiming that my dogwood tree posed a public hazard, and requested that I remove it immediately under threat of a lawsuit. The attorney's letter arrived on my doorstep with formal language that seemed intimidating at first glance, but reading carefully, it was riddled with inaccuracies, misquoted HOA regulations, and baseless claims. I responded with the documents I had already collected: the arborist report, inspection notes, HOA board minutes, and photographs showing that her own yard had sustained significant damage. I also included a detailed log of her harassment, demonstrating that her complaints were motivated by obsession, not legitimate concern. Karen was incensed. She began showing up at my property multiple times a day, sometimes pacing across her yard while recording videos of my tree, speaking into her phone as if broadcasting live to the HOA board or some imagined authority. Neighbors began whispering again, some offering support, others simply shaking their heads at her relentless behavior. Then, one afternoon, disaster struck, but this time it was entirely on Karen. A sudden summer storm swept through Willow Creek Estates. High winds rattled rooftops and bent tree branches in every yard. I watched from my living room window as Karen's backyard bore the brunt. One of her decorative trees, already weakened from prior neglect, snapped at the base and fell directly onto her garden shed. The crash was deafening, splintering wood and sending ceramic planters tumbling across the yard. I immediately grabbed my phone, calling the non-emergency line to report the damage and ensure no one was injured. Moments later, neighbors began streaming outside, drawn by the noise. Karen emerged, drenched and furious, trying to argue with anyone who approached. Her voice carried across the street. "This is not my fault. It's the wind. It's natural." But the spectacle had already drawn attention. One neighbor captured video of her yelling and gesturing wildly, posting it to a private neighborhood forum. The reaction was instantaneous, comments detailing her prior harassment of my tree, her obsessive behavior, and now her own property destruction. Karma, it seemed, was being documented in real time. Karen didn't stop there. In a final act of desperation, she tried to claim that I had somehow caused the storm damage by interfering with wind patterns or pruning branches incorrectly. The HOA, already aware of her escalating harassment, decided to intervene officially. 2 representatives from the board arrived at my property the next morning, along with a local code enforcement officer. Karen, seeing them approach, rushed outside, waving paperwork and demanding that the authorities take immediate action against me. She was frantic, shouting claims about illegal trees and property violations. The code enforcement officer calmly listened, reviewed the documentation, and then turned to Karen. "Based on the evidence provided, including arborist reports and HOA inspections, your claims are unfounded. Additionally, your repeated attempt to harass another homeowner violate community regulations. This behavior may have legal consequences." Her jaw dropped. She sputtered, trying to argue, but the HOA representative had already made notes on her conduct. They explained that repeated harassment could lead to fines, legal action, or even restrictions on her participation in community matters. At this point, the absurdity of the situation became apparent to everyone watching. Karen, who had spent weeks obsessively attacking a healthy tree, was now the subject of multiple complaints and official scrutiny. Her own yard's damage stood as a stark visual metaphor for her obsession backfiring. Then came the final act of poetic justice. While Karen was distracted by arguing with the HOA representatives, her partially collapsed shed shifted. One of the weakened support beams gave way entirely, causing part of the roof to cave in. The sound was catastrophic, sending debris scattering across the yard. Karen shrieked, stumbling backward, narrowly avoiding injury. Neighbors could hardly contain their reactions. Some gasped, others whispered gleefully, and a few discreetly filmed the chaos. The scene was both dramatic and almost cinematic, a real-life example of consequences catching up with obsessive behavior. The HOA representatives and code officer finally managed to calm Karen down, explaining the necessary steps for repairing her property and reiterating that further harassment would not be tolerated. Karen, visibly shaken, retreated into her home, no longer exuding the aura of control that had defined her for weeks. Meanwhile, My dogwood tree remained untouched, flourishing despite the chaos. Its leaves shimmered in the sunlight, a symbol of patience, preparation, and the importance of measured response. The contrast between the healthy tree and Karen's devastated yard was striking, and neighbors remarked on it repeatedly in the days that followed. By the end of the week, the HOA issued a formal notice to Karen, outlining that any further harassment or baseless complaints would result in fines and potential legal action. The letter was polite, professional, and unambiguous. Karen's leverage had evaporated entirely, and the community was aware of the outcome. Life returned to a quieter rhythm. My backyard became a place of calm, shaded by the tree that had sparked so much drama. Karen, now cautious and somewhat humiliated, avoided unnecessary interactions, retreating into her home. Neighborhood gossip persisted for a while, with most residents taking subtle pleasure in the reversal of fortune, but eventually normalcy returned. Through this ordeal, I learned several important lessons. 1. Documentation is power. Every email, report, and video recording ensured that the truth prevailed. 2. Obsession can blind reason. Karen's relentless focus on my tree caused her own downfall. 3. Community and authority matter. Neighbor support, HOA rules, and official intervention ensured fairness. 4. Patience pays off. By responding calmly and professionally, I allowed evidence and logic to triumph over aggression. She tried to ruin everything, but in the final showdown, karma delivers the ultimate lesson. She tried to control everything, but in the end, she paid the price for every outrageous move. The week after Karen's backyard disaster, Willow Creek Estates felt like a neighborhood finally exhaling. The gossip circulated quietly at first, then picked up momentum. Neighbors would smile knowingly as they walked past my yard, nod at the flourishing dogwood tree, and whisper about Karen's recent misfortunes. What had begun as petty obsession had escalated into a cautionary tale about entitlement, ego, and karma. I had returned to a normal routine, enjoying the calm, shaded backyard, and even began planting additional flowers around the dogwood, giving it a little ceremony of restoration. But deep down, I knew that Karen's story wasn't over. History had shown me that obsessive personalities rarely admit defeat quietly. They either escalate or retreat to plot another scheme. True to form, she escalated. It started subtly, with anonymous letters slipped under my door, warning that I was testing the community's patience. I saved everyone, documenting them meticulously. Then came the next audacious move. She tried to solicit other neighbors to support her fabricated claims, knocking on doors with a mix of charm and intimidation. Most politely declined. Some outright laughed at her, and a few forwarded her attempts to me. By now, my evidence file had grown impressively thick. Then came the climax, the final showdown. One Thursday afternoon, a moving truck pulled up to Karen's home. Her family, neighbors later revealed, had finally confronted her obsessive behavior and insisted on moving her out of the neighborhood. The timing was surreal. Karen had spent weeks trying to control, intimidate, and manipulate everyone around her, and now her own household had forced a departure from the very community she had sought to dominate. While the movers carried her belongings, her backyard remained a wreck. The fallen tree, broken shed, and scattered decorations made it almost impossible to navigate. Karen, furious and humiliated, attempted to organize her possessions despite the chaos, but the universe seemed to conspire against her. A gust of wind caught a loose tarp she was holding, flipping it over her head and causing her to stumble into one of her broken planters. The crash was comically catastrophic. I watched from my backyard, careful to maintain a polite distance, noting that my own life remained untouched while the consequences of obsession, entitlement, and reckless behavior unraveled spectacularly before me. Neighbors had gathered quietly to witness the moving process. Some whispered, some recorded on their phones. It was a surreal blend of irony and satisfaction, a live demonstration of karma's precision. But the universe was not done. The HOA, informed by multiple complaints and Karen's ongoing harassment, had taken official action. Fines for repeated baseless complaints were issued, legal warnings were sent, and restrictions on HOA privileges were imposed. Karen's attempt to manipulate HOA rules into a personal vendetta had backfired in every possible way, financially, socially, and reputationally. By late afternoon, the moving truck was loaded, Karen's fury contained only by sheer exhaustion, and she was escorted from the neighborhood. Her neighbors breathed a collective sigh of relief. Where she had once been a source of constant tension, her departure marked a restoration of peace and normalcy. In the days that followed, I received notes and messages from several neighbors, expressing gratitude for maintaining composure, documenting every incident, and allowing the HOA to intervene in an organized, professional way. One note humorously suggested, "Your tree should have a plaque, survivor of Karen's obsession." The dogwood tree became a quiet symbol of patience and endurance. Its branches swayed gently in the breeze, leaves glistening in the sunlight, standing tall while Karen's legacy of chaos faded from memory. Despite the dramatic conclusion, I reflected on the lessons this ordeal had taught me. 1. Patience and preparation are key. Documentation, calm responses, and evidence allowed the truth to emerge naturally. 2. Obsession backfires. Karen's relentless focus on control and intimidation led to her own humiliation and eventual departure. 3. Community support matters. Neighbors who witnessed events, spoke up, and provided evidence helped reinforce fairness and balance. 4. Humor can survive tense moments. Even amidst chaos, subtle acknowledgement of irony kept spirits up and tension manageable. Weeks later, life returned to normal. The neighborhood was quiet again, children played in the yards, and neighbors exchanged friendly greetings. The HOA issued reminders about harassment policies and clarified complaint procedures, preventing similar incidents in the future. Occasionally, a new resident would ask about the dramatic events, and neighbors would exchange knowing smiles. The story of Karen and the dogwood tree became almost legendary, a cautionary tale about entitlement, obsession, and the natural consequences of overreach. I would occasionally glance out the window at my flourishing tree, remembering the chaos it had inspired. Each leaf, each branch, seemed to whisper a quiet victory, not just mine, but the victory of patience, professionalism, and reason. Karen was gone, her threats dissolved into paperwork and warnings, her reputation tarnished beyond repair. And yet, the neighborhood had gained something invaluable, a story of justice, a reminder of the power of calm and evidence, and a sense of restored order.